Really happy to see all the beautiful faces here today. Some new faces, some old faces, some old friends, new friends. My name is Xiaowen Zhu. I'm the director of Center for Chinese Contemporary Art here in Manchester. Today is a very special day because first of all, it's the last public event we're hosting this year. And early next year, we have a pretty exciting news to announce to our community. But I'm not going to disclose it today because that's saved for a bit later. And second, we have two very special guests with us today. Actually, it's the first time they ever visit Manchester, even though they have been everywhere in the world. On my right side is Davide Quadrio. He is the director of the Museum of Asian Art, MAO, in Turin, Italy. And then on my right side here is You Mi. She's a professor of art and economics at the University of Kassel Documenta Institute. I actually have known both of them since many years ago, and especially with David, our first encounter happened when I was a college student actually in Shanghai. And David founded the first nonprofit contemporary art space, BizArt, co-founded with artist Xu Zhen. And of course, You Mi is also someone, over the past few years, our paths have crossed, and hopefully will cross, more in the future. So today we're just very happy to have both of them with us. We will just engage in this talk. It will be a bit more like a, conversation among friends, colleagues, and we really appreciate your presence today as well. And thank you for taking your time on this beautiful day. I know there are millions of people out there right now at the Christmas market. So obviously you do prioritize what's more important for you. So thank you very much for joining us. I think first to begin this conversation, since it's the first time Davide and You Mi are in Manchester, such a special occasion, would you like to just contextualize a bit to our audience today, how did you begin your practice in the art world? And you can determine which starting point you want to tell us. It can be a very selective narrative.
It needs to be. I'm not that young anymore. Should I start?
You start, because you're much
older. Thank you. To remind me that. I'm a sinologist, as you say. And I started in the late 80s, to be interested in Asia and China, especially actually a very particular kind of China that is the Himalayan part. So I've been trained as art historian, specialized in Tibetan architecture, and I moved to China in 1991. So now you can roughly understand that 30 years, I'm in my 50s already. And then I stayed there for the last 30 years, and I just moved back to Europe with a sort of very shocking passage, 4 years back, because of course I didn't thought of leaving China and not going back for such a long time. And I'm sure that some of the friends here know what is the feeling of being, completely disrupted in a certain way. And actually, instead of talking about what happened before, I think what is interesting how this experience changed, my practice and my thinking, or my identity somehow, in the sense that I found myself completely decontextualized. And it's funny to say that, as a white man, European, privileged, blah, 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 to be then somehow integrated, in a society that looks like you, but it's not really you, and also what it means to, what I should do, in this kind of context where, especially in Italy, going back was beautiful, because of course is a obscenely beautiful country. That is also a problem. Because then you feel like, somehow pampered every time that you do anything. But also this very strange feeling of really being decontextualized, and not understanding why we are still so much hooked up in our own histories, in our own narrative, in our own beliefs, and then for me was really a sort of interesting starting point and rethinking what I could do in this kind of context. And two things happened, which are both, for me, very exciting. One was this strange offer to teach, also in Venice, and it happened in a very strange way, because I was at the bus station, really, and Angela Vettese, a curator based between Milan and Venice, looked at me and said, why don't you come and, she was there, taking the tram, and I said, so we've been talking, and they looked at me and said, why don't you come and teach with our students? And said, but what should I do? What should I do? Think about something. So a week later I called her and I said, what I really would like to teach is actually to teach to the students. We were master students, so it was a master of 60 to 90 hours of teaching. And it's basically to change perspectives. And so we put together a very strange course in between a bit of historian theoretical and then getting into practice immediately, which was not an individual practice, but it was a group practice. It was not about making things, but about processes. It was about rethinking what space means, what time means, what collaboration means, what social structure means. And doing that through some of what I learned, for 25 years being in China, where I became who I am now through really practice. I was not trained in contemporary art. I was not trained as a curator. I was not trained as a producer. And so I had this amazing opportunity of actually working and doing in an environment that allowed me to explore, and to be confused by different signs, by different kind of cultural structures. So I tried, and of course it's a mediation, of course it's never something that is completely scientific or academic. It was more coming from my own guts and my experience, and actually reacting, and creating doubts, to students. So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is, which I also found very, life is so full of surprises, right? That I never thought of moving to touring, and to take care of a museum of the city that has an extraordinary collection, which is also very bizarre because it's a collection that was put together to create this museum only 15 years ago. 15, so only
So
only
younger than us, surprisingly.
Much younger than you. And to see a collection coming from Asia that is a certain kind of Asia as well, which is Japan, China, Himalayan region, Southeast Asia mainly, and some Central Asian sort of, Central Asian is, there is a beautiful collection of Uzbeki and Iranian ceramics, very, very good. And there is one of the only collection on Seleucia, on the Iraqi area, on the 3rd, 4th century, something like that, before Christ. Anyway, and so I found myself, in this position of having this amazing content coming from Asia in a very alienated situation like touring is, So again, it's some reverse situation, right? That I, being in Asia for so long, then come back and having antiquities around me and not life, I don't have any kind of particular affection to objects, actually, or this kind of veneration of objects. But I really appreciate the value of them more in what they can actually transmit or transfer in terms of energy, histories, narratives, and rituality as well. And so I found myself in this, in two different sort of situations, which bring me to what I think, we should also talk about it. It's like what it means to do what we do in this contemporary world, and what is responsibility, for instance, how we can work in art and culture to have, having a very distinctive socio-political, can say, support, or a way to vehiculate, some messages that I think are very important to do and to transfer to people in Europe at the moment. And it's very beautiful because, both projects are actually projects, I mean, you have a container, you have young human beings, who are found always extremely moving and incredibly powerful. This intergenerational relationship is so incredible, because it actually keeps you always on your toes, it keeps you always in this, you try to have somehow a connection, but then this connection, of course, is a connection that is not what you imagine can be. So you always need to reformulate as well, who you are through the eyes of the other generation, and I found that extremely powerful. And at the same time, all these antiquities, that they talk to me in a very powerful way, and somehow I know more than other, cultural references in Italy. And then what I'm gonna do with this material? How can I use it? To at least introduce, to the Italian people, but also, not only the Italian people, but to European people, what it means, what they mean, how powerful they are, and they're not only objects which are beautiful to see. They have their subjects, they have ritual aspects, they're funerary objects, especially for the China collection. This China collection is all from 5th century mainly to Tang Dynasty, and they're all coming, from tombs, really, so they're really funerary objects. So most of the things that we have in the collection are actually religious, and they're spiritual, they're ritual, so how you can activate them, what they mean really, and how you understand those, and so all that has been what is my practice is now. And just one word on the back, and that's it. So as I think it's sufficient what Xiaowen said. Was really China was for me the moment that I studied there. I studied Chinese. I studied I've been living there in the 90s. It was a privilege to be there in the 90s because it was a moment of huge changes and incredible speed and still this kind of naivete. That. And it's not a naivete from China, it's a naivete from my side, in getting into a cultural continent, not because it was a job, but because it was really a discovery, and that has been extremely precious and really shaped, what we did then, also in the contemporary art world, but that it was not contemporary art, it was living, it was life. It was a complete different mindset.
So acting while discovering, and discovering
yes.
while reshaping.
Yeah, and then it's something that is really powerful, and it doesn't happen that often. So for me, it's been, and it's maybe something that we can discuss later, but it's one of the things that I think that we need to bring back, to what it means to be in the art world now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. And Yomi, so in a way, you know, I feel like one thing I see how your trajectory intertwine is that, you know, you obviously everyone's born in one place, right? But then later on, then you expand your trajectory and going into different directions. And you know, on the larger scale, we could say, you know, David, you know, moved from Europe to China, then back to Europe, and then in your case, from China to Europe, and now also based in Europe. But then it's also much more complex than that. So please enlighten us.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I don't have a life in review kind of thing going on because Davida has just 20 more years of 20 more years behind you.
Are you really 20 more years left?
I think I know maybe 15.
This is really dramatic, actually, you know?
No, but actually, I mean, I think actually our interlocking paths sort of speaks really to the fact of how you can sort of traverse time in your work. So, you know, we actually started, I was maybe 7 years ago when you asked me to write a piece about this
collection.
Beizhou and Beiqi Buddhist images. I'm not an art historian, but I am a sort of closet medievalist, I think, if not a classicist. So I think my cutoff period is basically Tang, and everything pre-Tang is very dear to heart. Not to say, you know, everything that's actually more towards the western regions of China today, but also in Central Asia. That's where I spent most of my time outside of Europe Now, so we started out collaborating on that, and I didn't write an art historical text on the Beizhou and Beiqi Buddhist icons. Rather, I looked at that as a springboard to think about nomadism and what does it mean for the whole image of Buddha to travel from India to reach China, and actually what are the material conditions for carrying those images? Because, you know, in the Kushan dynasty, you would carve the Buddha's image onto a coin, and then you will carry it via merchants to places, and that's how the images actually got carried around back in the time. And then because of the material conditions, actually you cannot reproduce the images as accurately, and the way an image actually travels, or how this transfer happens has very much to do with the material condition. So that was something I was looking at, and then we steadily moved on to working on the Ai Weiwei show and on the Qiu Zhijie show. So that's all contemporary Chinese art par excellence, and you know, in museum.
Yeah, actually, very strange selection we had of collaboration.
I know. So just to say, you know, I think that could be a footnote to what you ended with in terms of actually, we don't necessarily have to. Limit ourselves to one historical period, you know, such is happening a lot in museums these days. But in terms of myself, there are different narratives. Maybe I'll choose the more. So I obviously have this more historical side. I travel, as I like to put it, physically and metaphysically along the Silk Road. But looking at the Silk Road as a potential figuration for rethinking networks, for rethinking technology. So I have this sort of very, I guess, speculative way of thinking that connects ancient technology to futuristic technology, ancient forms of the society to futuristic or societies to come. I guess I can focus a bit more on the futuristic side.
Since we're in Manchester.
Since we're in Manchester.
It's the city of the future.
You know what? On the way here, I mean, now I have the Center for Contemporary Chinese Art, and I know also SODA in Manchester now. But before coming here on the way, I was thinking there are three things that I know about Manchester. One is Joy Division, which is my all-time favorite band. I'm sure that's going to earn me some, I guess, credits from the locals. But we're not going to talk about that. A second thing is the art and craft movement, which I'll be very happy to check out. You know, the material leftovers of that, and I think it's still very important for my work today in the sense that, you know, it's it's one of the earliest instances where people rethought the relation of art and the role of art in the society, right? The third thing is, of course, the birth of industrial capitalism and Friedrich Engels and all of that, which is also quite important in my work.
We'll have to go to see his statue after this talk.
Yes, I'm going to do. I actually want to pay tribute to all three.
You didn't know much more than I do, actually.
See, it's classical, but
Classical.
so by way of that, I think I can talk a bit about what I do these days. So I work at the Documenta Institute, which is
In Germany.
in Kassel, in Germany. For those who don't know, it's a quite provincial German city.
But has one of the most important contemporary art festival.
Called Documenta,
Yeah.
which happens every 5 years. So imagine a city with 250,000 inhabitants, and then the visitor number to Documenta every 5 years will be, I think this year was close to 800,000. So the city will be filled over the course of 100 days. That's exactly the length of the festival or the exhibition. The city becomes something very different. And interestingly, the city's residents, they really identify with the festival, with Documenta. It's been 70 years or so. And all the sort of household names in contemporary art, like Joseph Beuys, they kind of all made their very special contributions to Documenta, to the city of Kassel and all of that. So I am appointed to head a department called Art and Economies. That's a new field of research. And at the same time to situate that in the context of this Documenta Institute, which is about, not exclusively about Documenta itself, but rather about the broader role of art in the society. So I arrived and I started looking what is missing in the current sort of academic landscape in Germany. It's quite different from here, and even though Germany wants to internationalize its academia, there are so few non-Europeans working there.
Let alone East Asian.
Let alone East Asian. I think I might be one of the 2 or 3. And also, I don't work in area studies departments. Right? That's the other thing that I always find a bit quite limiting, because you're always asked to perform a certain identity in a foreign context like that. And increasingly these days, I say, please see me as a German when I'm in Germany, because I do speak German quite well, and I deal mostly with German and European issues, and I actually know the ways about that. Probably, I have certain ideas about how to do that, and I think it's important, and I can do it. So let me just do that, and then when I'm back in China, which hopefully will happen soon, can I just please be the Chinese, right? Because what usually happens is the other way around. You're always the Chinese in Germany, and you're always the sort of no longer the Chinese back in China. So that's kind of my positioning, self-positioning in this whole thing. And for the Documenta Institute, I started looking at, to give them something that's more art history and more about the institutional history of Documenta. I looked at what are the missing narratives to Documenta. Obviously, Documenta has always been the most important and the largest contemporary art exhibition in the world, and has been steadily incorporating non-West artists since the 90s. With the Katrin David edition in 1997. So, there's a sort of, complacency or a certain narrative about how Documenta sort of represents, the most important contemporary art trends in the world. And the progressiveness.
Right? And beyond European identity.
Yes. So I got there and I started digging into roles of certain institutions, such as Goethe Institute, and exactly which are the artists that they actually supported quite a few years before some of these artists would end up at Documenta. So for example, Goethe Institute is sort of the British Council, right? With I think a much less, so Goethe Institute is interesting because it's not supposed to, because Germany is the defeated country of Europe, and it's not supposed to be proud about its cultural identity. So the Goethe Institute had been mostly doing language training programs, but has also done quite idiosyncratic kind of artistic and cultural programs, depending on the interests of the directors. But they've been creating really interesting art and film and media workshops in the 80s and 90s, and they did it in such a way that was really more about two-way communication, it's less cultural imperialism as we understand it, and we just started reconstructing the whole network of people that were sent. These are quite famous German media artists or filmmakers such as Harun Farocki, but also lesser known ones. And they were sent everywhere, like Manila, Jakarta, Seoul, Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, a lot of quote-unquote third world countries still all the time. And among them, they trained people like Rax Media Collective, Amar Kanwar, and all of these way before they became famous, right? So after that, like 10 years after they attended some Goethe Institute workshops, they would actually end up at a Documenta. And so we're very interested in that sort of narrative, which I think is a missing narrative of the current art history writing of Documenta. So that's something more on the historical side. On the more futuristic side, which is where I think it's really more dear to heart. We really try to pose the question: how can we imagine economies differently? How can we imagine different forms of value and recognizing and honoring different forms of value, such as care, such as all of this reproductive labor that we do, such as all this informal sort of, things that are going on between you and your friends, and this sort of whole social network that really can be something that holds you up when you're depressed or something, right? So all of these do not have, and it's also good that they do not participate in the current market-based economic system. But there are maybe ways of interfacing, for example, the care aspect of that with the general economy. So one project, maybe to make it a bit more concrete, is to look at how peer-to-peer care can become a backbone for a different kind of social welfare system.
No, it's interesting that you're saying that, because it really reminds me of this particular time in Asia, which was the end of the 90s, when I started really working in a sort of, the speed of changes, and I'm talking about China only, I'm talking about East Asia. And it's actually not by chance that, Ruan Rupa, Parasite in Hong Kong, the Bamboo Curtain in Taiwan, Samsi in Korea, just to name a few, and the Long March project in Beijing, Bizarre as well, there were, what's the name, there were several places as well in Hong Kong, there was places in Macau, there were, Kunming, and it's exactly what you're saying, at that time that there was not market, or the market was something very, very distant, it was, there was a bit of an echo of that, after, especially in China after 1993, when, for the first time Chinese artists got into the Venice Biennale in a sort of strange, almost forced, independent way. So that was the moment that you're describing in a way, you know, it was like a different kind of economy, but it was more this very powerful network of almost like a psychological help, you know, like it was basically based on supporting each other, you know, in just because you existed, you know, and so you were able to share, you know.
Yeah.
And that was extremely powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I do absolutely agree, and I think I sort of came of age in the early 2000s. I did experience a bit of that, but you know, as everything goes, there's always sort of a dark side to that, and that's usually when at some point a certain market, in this case, the sort of art market or the contemporary art circle, starts essentially monetizing on that or capitalizing on that. So a lot of, what was essentially interpersonal relations or informal care gets a certain symbolic status and a symbolic value. And I mean, I guess the best case is of course this documenta where Ruang Rupa, this Indonesian collective, they've been around for over 20 years. They've always kind of championed and really self-declared as a very informal kind of, collective where they collaborate with each other, where they have a certain structure for self-governance, where they use, they prioritize values such as humor and care and all of this. But, at some point it becomes a bit too much of a performativity of that rather than what it really is. And the problem with Ruang Rupa and a lot of the other collectives that were shown, or quite a few of the collectives that were shown at this documenta is, and this is, once again, me being the very kind of historical materialist, looking into the what is happening, but really trying to see what is behind the scene and what are the material conditions, what are the institutions behind that, and then very soon you reach a certain socio-economic layer and you realize that really a lot of the collectives are bankrolled by different NGOs. And this is really absolutely fine, right? But at which point, when you're getting, say, US embassy money in a post-regime change Tunisian city to create public art in order to get the children actually something to do and to, make people somehow more emotionally resilient. Because let's just be honest, that life is much, much harder after the Arab Spring than it was before. And you're getting US embassy money for doing that, just that. And there's all this package of like, you have to have a social media concept to make sure you're live streaming all of this and getting a lot of likes and things like that. So it's quite tricky, right? NGO, and especially the sort of developmental aid money is very, very tricky, but that's happening a lot in the quote-unquote global south. And once again, I'm all for
we all been part of
exactly.
Somehow.
I mean, it's some David Tay calls it a food chain of sponsors and donors. I think it's completely fine to acknowledge that, as long as you acknowledge that. The problem with this document, unfortunately, is that they don't do that enough, and they don't, there's a general sort of celebration of collectivity, of community, helping each other, but not showing you, what are the material conditions for that.
Which is...
But I have some other ideas, no? I have a more...
Yeah.
Actually, I want to create a different funding system for the art world, but that's the futuristic part, and I'll save it for later.
Which I'm very interested to hear, but it's interesting that you get into that, because there is not one recipe, right, in a way. And it is true that even if you think about, somehow the cultural, artistic environment in China, right around the years that you left and just after, like 5-6 years, before the market, got really into China in a very violent way. And I really remember it was 2006, when they opened the first contemporary art fair in Shanghai. It was called Shanghai Contemporary. And then in 6 months, and everything changed, in an incredibly violent way. Like artists, they were, already well established, and they were selling works, for 10,000, 20,000 pounds. Out of the sudden, they were selling at 1 million, 1,500,000. Like some of the friends that we know, like Jian Li, that was nobody, in literally 3 months became millionaire, and so that nobody in the sense that it was too Western for the Western taste of exoticizing China. So for many years, for 15 years of his career, even almost 20 actually, nobody was really looking at his work. And then out of the sudden, here we are, and then it was chosen as, the artist to go to New York, and then it was just put in a New York gallery, and in literally like few months became millionaire. And that happened for many artists, and then changed completely the environment, of course, But what is the, it's something that, as for me, it's been always an incredible, complicated issue, right? So on one side, you have an amazing European system. European talking, but European is not only European because, the UK Anglo-Saxon system is very different to the Italian one. But somehow this kind of idea, the culture needs to be supported, and then, there is an institutional way of approaching that. And it also comes, with techniques, papers, giving back to society, structures, that somehow you don't know if it's actually better or worse than having a terrible BMW paying you money to do a car. I mean, it's it's
BMW
complicated.
actually might be good because it has less strings attached.
Well.
Wow.
Well, I think that many interesting threads happening now, in the space of, of the conversation. I'm also sure the audience are popping up, different thinking and questions. Let them bloom a bit, but I want to bring it back a bit to the topic of today, which is cross-cultural curation in and beyond Asia. And I feel like between the two of you, how do we reposition, redefine Asianness, in the context of contemporary art? I know that this question itself, the notion, can be also reductive, but it is still a very populated question, that we as practitioners, we almost face it every day. And also, as you both know, that our center has been going through this transformational period. We're asking ourselves, what does Chineseness mean? What does Asianness mean? Especially in the UK context, but also in the global context. So just wonder if you can both share some thoughts.
You start and I follow.
Yeah, okay. So I think I've diversified my portfolio a bit because I've never been quite happy with just that question. I mean, Chineseness has always been the sort of the subject of discussion. So I never quite associate myself as a Chinese curator or a curator primarily working with Chinese contemporary art or Chinese art or whatever. I've been quite, I'm as I said, medievalist and travel a lot in Central Asia, Greater Central Asia, and really try to look at things in their kind of historical connections, and that basically leads me to working quite a lot as a curator now, but I also write about that. Making projects, artistic curatorial projects in pretty much everywhere, starting from the Black Sea to the Japanese Sea, trying to find a good way. I mean, I also work a lot with Slavs and Tatars, and they have this very nice way of, describing their practice as bookended by the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China. So that's sort of the geographical area that I also cover.
It's not too wide.
It's not too wide. It's just between two walls and between some seas. And for me, it's really about the historical connection. So, for example, I will be commissioned by the Asia Culture Center in South Korea to look at the Silk Road.
Which was a wonderful project. Was there, fortunately.
Yes.
I was so happy.
But also increasingly sort of looking at I guess the Chinese diaspora connections in Southeast Asia, working with institutions in Singapore, such as at the Singapore Art Museum. So I think so I guess maybe I've always been trying to avoid the question of China, and that's how I ended up doing all of this. But in a way, when such a question arises, I think my default answer is first to look at the multiplicity of that, right? So I was one of the curators of the last Shanghai Biennale. Currently, actually, the last one, we don't know what is going to happen with that institution, given all the COVID and crazy cultural policies and everything going on in China. So at the press conference of the last Shanghai Biennale, of course, the foreign journalists were going to ask the Chinese curator, the only Chinese curator in the team, about the Chinese artists, about how many Chinese artists there are in this show, and what is your role. I didn't actually only focus on the Chinese artists, obviously, but also I asked them, how many Chinas there are that we're actually trying to present here, because you have like cosmopolitan Chinese artists like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen-based Chinese artists. You have those living in third-tier cities, which we presented actually. You have those who are represented by OK galleries or blue chip galleries, but also those who are not represented by any galleries. We also presented some of them. So I think it's really about the
and also it's not only about geography, right? There is a very big difference between the Zhongguo and the Zhonghua, in that sense.
Yeah.
No?
That's a very scholarly debate.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That's
anyway,
You're a sinologist. I'm not. I'm a media theorist.
Exactly. We sinologists. No, but no, for me, if you want to reverse that question, and I completely agree about what Yumi says, there is now one China, there is now one Italy, there is now one UK. Actually, UK is United Kingdom, so at least they have already the federation, sort of. But it is true that China is actually a multiple China, and that stretches to Singapore, to Indonesia, that it gets global to the States, and now, of course, also in Europe. But for me, when they ask me this question, it's more about how I always reverse it, in the sense that I don't think about Chineseness, because the moment that you get into that, you start getting into exoticizing things, while I actually always reverse it to the fact that I think Chineseness is a definition that actually should be bringing doubts to people who has not connection to China whatsoever. And instead of thinking about that, should be actually pushing them into knowledge. One of the things that I'm doing always is thinking, how less the West in general knows about China versus, how much China actually, all other cultures know about, European culture, and then of course it's because we know a lot of, imperialism and all that, but is also the knowledge, the cultural hubris, that is invested in.
Yesterday,
Western.
me and I, we were at this conference in Birmingham. Yeah. The topic is on, cultural diplomacy. So
I could actually speak about that.
Please.
I think maybe an important addition to that is also not to be afraid when you don't know the whole picture, because how many people in China can read and make sense of, say, the court chronicles, like in classical Chinese, and actually know what and when happened and which year, which is something that I try to do because I have to keep up with my classical Chinese before it gets too rusty. So yeah, it's not like, people in China actually have a very decent idea of their own history and culture and, all these multiple ethnicities and all of that, interactions with quote unquote foreign countries. And then, so, we shouldn't also, I guess, demand that, or that shouldn't become a barrier for those who are not ethnically Chinese to try to understand China, because I think that could be really perceived as a
this
huge
is exactly
barrier.
the point.
Yeah,
you know?
and then sometimes it can also be cultural appropriation and all of this. So one thing, recently I was at a discussion about the Tashkent Film Festival, which was this sort of it ran from the 1960s, sponsored by the Soviet Union in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, essentially trying to bring all this third world country cinema together, right? So there you will have I guess, more or less horizontal kind of exchange between filmmakers from Indonesia to Mali to China at some point. China actually dropped out at some point. But the question, the really interesting point is, there was actually a lot of cultural appropriation going on, or what we would call cultural appropriation today, which will be basically, actually back in the days, China had such things where, Zhu Mingying from this Oriental dance, song and dance company, which was created also in this sort of post-Bandung moment about third worldism, about anti-imperial, struggles of all the recently decolonized countries. So, they would send Chinese singers and dancers to an African nation to learn the traditional dance there, and they will come back and perform that dance, but they will do it black-facing, which is, in today's terms, not okay, because, how can you do black-facing? But interestingly,
well,
at
it's
the
not
time,
okay in a certain kind of framework, which is very much in the Anglo-Saxon
exactly, and because we
way of
had
approaching
post-colonialism, because we have all of these discourses, but actually back then people were just doing that. So you had Zhu Mingying and this Oriental song and dance ensemble doing that. You had any number of that kind of cultural appropriation going on between third world countries. And then the question is, why is it, or is it okay? And under which conditions is it okay? Is it because there was a common anti-imperialist struggle and then it was okay? And that's actually a way to maybe relate it back to cultural policy, this cultural policy question of China, because we have to say China really has very poor cultural policy these days. So if you think about the whole BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, all these infrastructural projects sponsored by essentially the state everywhere in Africa, Central Asia, Near East, it comes sometimes with this sort of cultural program, and these are the most kind of regimented forms of essentially importing elements of the New Year gala in terms of sing and dance, and doing something like dumplings, and then doing some calligraphy,
But
and
this
then doing
actually,
it in an African country.
all countries are doing this kind of strange diplomatic, cultural sort of outreach programs, right? I mean, if you think about, I was in India last year, and then the Italian embassy was doing these festivals on pizzas, and
I was just
Oh,
going to ask
really?
if it's
So-
about pizza making.
Yeah,
I
so,
literally was
you
going to
know-
ask.
Oh, the bar is quite low.
and then and it's still extremely,
But you know what? I would sign up. That's the thing. We have a
well,
club here called Dumpling Social Club. But it's actually
Yeah.
it's an art club. It's actually not like making dumpling, but still people
Yeah,
sign
yeah.
up, right? Because
Yeah.
they hear dumpling, they want to sign
okay.
up.
Yeah. No, so I mean, okay.
wrap it up, babe. Wrap it up.
Bring it home.
I think food is actually a pretty good common denominator. It's a lower one for me. So I mean, what I'm trying
Don't
to
say that.
no,
We're
we're Italian, we're Chinese.
We're on
I know. We're not even
I
going
mean,
to start it. We're not starting.
Respect your own country and mine as well.
I'm saying.
Now it's
See?
a dumpling pizza fight.
Yeah. So actually.
No, there is no need of fighting. They can come together.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Just
So
put the dumpling on top of the pizza.
The point, so the point I was trying to make is between this sort of lowest form of common denominator being, cooking together, and then, understanding the whole history
Yes.
and culture and politics of one country. There has to be some intermediary, steps or places where people can actually sort of dock onto, because right now it feels that it's either just that, in terms of Chinese foreign cultural policy, is just reducing the country to
Or
dumplings
academic.
and some super,
Or academic.
I mean, but academic
Yeah, but anyway,
yeah,
they
or
do
that,
exist in
right?
that
So,
level.
and I wonder, for our kind of discussion, I mean, obviously we're interested in everything that's kind of in between, and to, maybe sometimes it's focused on a very specific topic, maybe it's looking at things more trans-regionally. Interestingly, recently I was at a kind of a think tank thing of the IFA, Institute for
Institute for Foreign
Relations in Germany.
It sounds very political, but actually it's primarily a cultural.
It's a cultural institution. So they sort of make the cultural policy, and they look at cultural, how Germany should interact with China through cultural activities, and they're at this point of essentially not knowing what to do with China. So they put a bunch of people.
Very few people know now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they put a bunch of people together who do work back and forth to think about that. And I got there, and I realized that also from the German side, a lot of that thinking is quite low, or they.
Yeah, but that is common actually, and I think there is
I want to change it. And then I started by looking at. Okay, IFA's problem on that is that they actually, even though they're not political, they do receive certain, high-level sort of mandates from the German Foreign Ministry. So they explained their vision or their motivation to me first as we want to mediate a certain more open. We want to mediate the social value of openness to China. And I was like, okay, that's something that we can work on, right? So for you, China doesn't have this open sort of value, but then can we not look at specific questions or issues such as aging, or questions of, what do you do with villages, or what do you do with education in the rural villages? And then if we cannot even talk about China, let's put China and Singapore together so that, you can at least help me define which are the barriers you just cannot cross. Because, Singapore is actually mildly authoritarian, but still has an overwhelmingly positive image, right? So it's, which part? Are you looking at the capacity of the government? Are you looking at this? Are you looking at the really one-to-one form of democracy?
There is always a huge, impossible way of putting the level that you're talking about with the level of social societies. So then you talk about this kind of interconnections and capacity also of understanding each other, if you want to, that it could be a multiple understanding. It doesn't have to be like, as you're saying, like UK versus China, but it can be a triangle. Exactly. It can be, organization to organization. But what is interesting, I think, is that it doesn't come through systems of thinking only. It comes and is rooted into very particular hybrid or experiences, practices, which are always extremely rooted in the situation that you are, not depending by your knowledge and race and where you come from and cultural background, but is done really by living in that particular context, understanding that particular context, and then from that, finding ways. And this is the reason why it's so important to have practitioners, who are, who've been working, with, and we were saying today with Xiaowen, that took very conscious decisions in putting themselves in hybrid identitarian situations, which made you a very complicated human beings because, it fractures you, not only linguistically, but also culturally. But at the same time, you are in the position of creating, a sort of ayato zone that allows you to move in and out continuously, of a situation. And then in this keeping on jumping into different kind of you yourself, your identity then eventually allows you, then to be in a certain way able to mirror or to look at, problems that you're talking about in a sort of, I wouldn't say appropriate, but in a sort of
Constructive?
It's a bit more distilled way, with a bit of maybe less of fear, less of fear of not knowing, or fear of knowing only partially, or and one of the things that I see always in the situation that you're talking about, Yomi, which is kind of top-down, ideas of, let's find a way now to work back with China, What does it mean?
Exactly, because in that question itself, China is just an abstract concept,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, but it can be also, let's work with Italy or let's work with UK,
Yeah, it's also super bilateral, which
it's super,
for me is not interesting.
Which is not, I mean, cultural movements and exchanges have always been hybrid, they've been always like transforming things, as you were saying, Buddhism came into China, in a very strange way, and, it went through, and, like what Buddhism was in India was, lost for centuries already when it got into China, and it was based on very anthropomorphic Buddhism, while, in India was not, and then it was also through all the Middle Eastern appropriation, of classical, the Gandhara thing, so the Kushan, so, it's, at the end of the day, and anyway, if you think about Buddhism, is not for, in China, it's a Western religion, it's not an Eastern religion, the COG.
Journey to the West.
So, we always have, we have it there.
East and my West.
Yes. So, anyway, I don't want to get too philosophical, actually, because I'm not, but it's interesting to see that a lot of, and that is actually what really, drives me. I'm very happy to be in Turin in this little museum, in a beautiful 18th century palace, because you have this kind of material completely decontextualized, and you can really use it, to at least create the doubts of what you see. And I think that in the West, I'm thinking about, I don't know if you ever seen, there was this beautiful project in Gasworks a few months back by Gala Paros Kim, who basically took a, how do you call it, a sarcophagus? How do you say that in English? I don't remember. So the tomb of the pharaoh, basically. And that is at the British Museum. And she decided to just do a simple thing, that it was to move to recreate the tomb in the gallery, to move simply the tomb in a way that it should be as in ritual objects, in the context of that particular religion, and that particular historical time. And I think these kind of things are very powerful, right? Because they give to the people who don't know, at least the doubts of thinking that you need to maybe open up to the fact that your knowledge and your way of approaching things, it's not the unique one, it's not the only possibility. And funnily enough, Yumi, I don't find this that much in other cultures that are not European. I mean, you can have this fantastic, suprematism in other cultures as well, if you think about Japan or even China, but also this idea of Chineseness as is in the postmodern China is also very different of being Chinese, in the historical time, So if you think, I mean, I'm saying, very simple things, but if you think that, Sima Qian was not even, like the first historian, it was not even Han, it was not Chinese, right? But it comes out to be
Yes, Sima Qian.
Sima Qian, no? So, and
from Central Asia.
from Central Asia, yeah. So we don't, maybe it was
Mm-hmm.
Persian or I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, but it was, it's part of being Chinese, and it created history of China, right? And to be Chinese, it was being Chinese as through the examinations, through the levels of knowledge. It was not ethnicity per se. And maybe I'm simplifying, okay? But in a way, it is true that the modernity is created also in the rest of the world a sort of adaptation, to a certain kind of West that I don't see happening in a vice versa mode. And then I think is something that should be interesting to consider, right? And that it was also, going back to what you were saying about the Ruang Rupa, that for me was very painful to see, and is that no matter the reasons, no matter the, how to call it, the complexity or the doubts, about what is true or not in this kind of collectivism, this kind of idealism, and this kind of looking at the world through the spectacle of goodness, because when you work together, you're happy, and I show what, group of people being happy in doing what they do, But what I found very painful for me in the situation that happened, with this Nazi moment, and this reaction by, I don't know if you followed what happened with Documenta, maybe contextualize a bit.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to talk about this per se, but I think what I wanted to just to explain why I felt that it was wrong from a Western point of view to act in such way. So just to contextualize, in Documenta there was a particular work that it was shown also before, the historical work that was done 20 years ago during the Suharto regime, and there was a particular figure that was depicted, was painted on, that represented that it was offensive for the Jew community. Okay, I simplify. Okay, but and that created a spin-off of.
Was the largest cultural political scandal in Germany this summer, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But what happened that is for me very irresponsible is the censorship that it was acted upon a piece that I understand that in Germany was very sensitive, but it didn't have anything to do with Germany.
Yeah.
And it was done in a particular, very complex, Indonesian historical moment. And the thing that, because I was listening to the conversation that they had, the artistic, the artist and also the artistic curators, together with the director of Documenta, about this particular topic, and is how the censorship was put in place, and how abruptly the work was teared down, damaging it, and then immediately I thought, how the rest of the world is conjuring against, whatever happens in China about censorship, or about, how looking down, the West has been behaving for so many years, whilst, being myself part of that scenery during those years. Of course we had problems, but we've been able, there are always, abilities, that you can put in place to solve, socio-political resistances. And for me, what really mattered was that doing this from a Western country to other cultures have been suffering, different kind of censorship, creates a precedent that will vanify everything that has been built in the last 30 years. Because now, whatever happens in the Shanghai Biennale or in Beijing or whatever, immediately the government will say, well, but even Documenta censored a work because it was sensitive for their own culture. So why cannot? So this kind of lack of responsibility, this way of thinking only that your criteria of judgment are the only criteria possible, that for me is the bottom end of what, Europe, and I'm talking about Europe, I'm not interested in talking about the West because I don't know how much we are in common with USA or Canada, really. But if I think about, let's say a very diversified Europe, I'm actually shocked about that because it doesn't champion what it says. It actually creates, yet another very irresponsible, can say behavior, that can actually open up incredibly complicated consequences, without even think about that. And then I think for me, it's something that in 2022, I don't know, it really I felt that it was, and it still have, So to go back to what we were saying, I think that is, being, if you want, people like you, Shawen, now that you're here, I mean, there is a huge responsibility, and it's also very much a political responsibility of occupying institutions in a way that you're able, to create very different systems, like Yumi was saying, finding ways, to create complicated systems which are somehow alternatives, to a monolithic thinking about, validation of culture, validation of projects, validation of economies,
Ethics, values, right,
Yeah,
etc.
but then maybe I think one important addition to that. I mean, I will not go into this document. I have for those.
No, you had enough.
Exactly, and for those who are interested, I have an eFlux text on this.
But you remember, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too good, and actually, the West is producing a lot of such instances where it's too good for China not to say this is double standard. It's not a question of censorship or things like that. So but the world is at a point of essentially splitting into many different worlds. So I think we're only going to see more of that. But I'm going to say one point about this sort of institutional aspect. I have a very complex view on this document, and you can read about it on my eFlux text. I think one...
if you Google Yomi eFlux, E-flux. eFlux is a very famous platform, for intellectual writing on contemporary art. So you can find Yomi's full
I
text.
actually didn't read it. I'm going to read it tonight.
Please read it. Okay, but I'll just mention one point, which is, yes, it's important to know our values and what we stand for and to create these alternatives. At the same time, you do have to be sensitive to the local context. The most fatalist, the fatalist thing that this document, and I'm not even saying Rangrupa because it's actually also the management and it's like the whole machine. One of the really quite regretful thing that happened was that all the time they didn't have, or they didn't want to publicly claim that this is actually not about us. Okay? It's about German right-wing politics, and German right-wing politicians are going, or there are those who are more hooligans on the ground, creating those random blog posts alleging Rangrupa or some of the artists for being anti-Semitist. But then higher up, you have all these right-wing parties backing those initiatives, and essentially what was going on was at a very high level, at the federal level. Between right-wing politicians and those who are in the center left, the ruling ones, SPD, the Social Democrats and the Greens. The Green Cultural Minister was very much under attack because of all this, because initially she tried to mitigate this, and she in the beginning actually stood on the side of the curators from Rangrupa. At the lower level, the land Hesse level, the cultural minister had also always stood by Rangrupa and publicly claimed that Rangrupa and this document is not anti-Semitist until very unfortunately this image happened, and then you just cannot defend that claim. And this is detrimental in terms of politics. And at some point, Rangrupa and all the other artists who feel personally attacked because they were, for me, the regretful thing was that they were not able to say, yes, this is very, very terrible, prejudice against all of us, but we recognize that this is not just about us, okay? And let's just put that aside for a second and say this is, and acknowledge what it is really about, which is about German politics. Now, if somebody could have said that, it shows a certain sensitivity to what it means to actually build an institution, because it's much easier to just denounce because, after this document, Rangrupa walks away okay and becoming, of course, #1 on the art review power list. Mm-hmm. And they can always say, we felt very much victimized by this German bureaucratic system, but also the German media, terrorizing us all the time. You can do that, but what about that institution?
True, but there is also the fact that that I see that all the time. I've been seeing that all the time in China, for many years, when projects were coming into China. For instance, from at one point, of course, all Europe and wanted to come to China through culture because it was the way to come in, and there were situations that were also complicated because they were bringing in things without considering the context.
Yeah.
So the thing is, it's exactly that. That why Europa should have. I'm not trying to defend that. It's only about exactly the same principle, right?
They were asked to do something and they did exactly that. However, what was at stake was the whole institution and, let's say, even, larger level politics.
They did the same. It's also their nature, no?
Yeah.
If you invite them to do that and to deconstruct and
I'll tell you what,
because they're very sensitive too.
I'm terribly sorry.
No, it's okay, sorry.
We do want to leave 15
Actually, we didn't want to talk about that, but it's okay.
We wanted to leave 15 minutes
yes,
to audience
please,
Q&A because I noticed no one has left yet, right? No one has left yet to join the, Christmas party, outside, in the
brave,
city center.
Very brave,
very brave. Again, shows, this audience really knows how to prioritize. So let's give the audience some time, if that's okay, if there's any question from the audience.
Don't be shy. We are not, so it's okay. Just bring it in.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah, it's a question for both David and Yomi. I just want to know if there's any particular curators or thinkers that really help build your practice, or kind of build your narrative throughout your career.
On the theoretical level.
Please both.
Sorry, I didn't get a question.
Curators and thinkers.
If you have some curator or thinkers or that have been very pivotal in our practice. For me, was somebody that was really changes throughout the time. At the beginning, for me, was very, very important Hans van Dyck, who was this amazing scholar, actually, who unfortunately died very young, based in Beijing. Was the founder of China Archives and Warehouse.
Yeah.
And that for me was a very inspiring person, and the way that we've been working together was very beautiful. There was a show about him in Witte de With, what it was called Witte de With. Now it's what's called what? Melly, I don't know, anyway. So, and there was a publication that was made, and it's a very interesting figure, in the China contemporary art most more recently for me, Donna Haraway has been one of the, thinker that I really relate to. In terms of other curators and practice, nothing really comes to my mind so quickly. You mean?
That's a difficult one.
Yeah.
I think actually there are some people who help me really understand my role in art,
Mm-hmm.
and that includes, somehow really kind of, honing my skills, right, in terms of making a show and being sensitive to the space and things like that. So on that front, it was Ruth Nowak, who was also one of the curators of Documenta 15 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
13? No, 12.
The 12, yeah. So 2007. She was my mentor at some point in this Guangzhou Biennale curator course or fellowship. But that's something that I think still kind of happens within the parameters of the arts itself. I think for me, increasingly, what's important is to understand how can we circumscribe the field and to understand what are the adjacent fields and how we can essentially, by having a more systemic understanding of the society, to redefine the role of art in the society. So I didn't get to speak about my futuristic plan about art funding and things like that, but this is all very much coming from, I guess, on the one hand, a critique of the valuation processes within the art world, and essentially, the claim of the autonomy of art, or the claim to a certain critical virtue of art, and how that gets very well capitalized and actually lubricates, if anything, capitalism itself better than anything else. And there are a bunch of Goldsmith-based scholars working on that: Suhail Malik, Galia, Sadavi, Marina Witt-Schmidt. Some of them are friends, some are people I read. But I think what that leads me to realize is really that instead of asking the question, how can we be more political in the art, for example, which is something that a lot of artists do, a lot of artists also feel compelled to do because that's where the funding is coming from, is really no longer, we cannot act within our own confines. We actually need to ask the question, how can we be part of a social process, or how can we be part of a social movement, for example? And so one of the projects we did at the Documenta Institute recently is to work with a labor organizer, those working with platform workers, cheap airline workers, tech workers, the most precarious forms of, this is beyond the traditional union structure. And then, they do their political education and organizing training, but we sent a couple of artists who are really cherry-picked and who we know can work within such a context, and then they will give them some tools to express themselves differently or to relate to each other differently. And these artists are now going to extract something out of this and make an artwork, but it's really more about sending them into those social organizations and movements over a much longer period of time, so that something will happen there, right? So I think this kind of, thinking beyond the confines of our art world has become very important for me.
For me too.
I have a question over there.
Other than what you were just saying, how do you feel about then, like, the fact that art is a cause, and especially in the UK, for a lot of gentrification? Like, well, you can see it in the neighborhood in which we are in. Like, I'm from Manchester, and this area used to be really not you wouldn't walk through here at night. So it's how do you feel about the fact that because you're saying it's not about the artist extracting when we did that, but more art programs. How would you see it rather than extracting and causing gentrification actually giving back to
community?
Yeah. Do you have a good answer? I mean, I've worked on some urban redevelopment projects back in
Me
China.
too.
So we're not innocent because because you know, if you actually want to get some decent money to support some artists, you have to do that. But I mean, I think we have to come down to, I don't have a good answer, but I think we have to come down to some maybe more granular definitions of what gentrification stands for, because it cannot, I mean, you know, it's kind of morally bad, right? But actually, it might describe, you know, we have to define it as, you know, maybe improving sewage system in one area, right? That can be good. And then it's like, you know, getting a lot of tourists into that, which may not be good. So once you have a granular definition, you have more tools to address some of them. So for us, you know, working back in the center of Beijing, we're like, okay, we made a whole master plan for a redevelopment project, and we have this very detailed sort of, you know, tiers of different kinds of businesses, and we said, so basically the idea is to slow down gentrification because it's not stoppable. But we said, okay, within the first 15 years, you cannot have Starbucks, you cannot have McDonald's, and all of this. And then you have to have a certain system of, you know, so say you get artists to use some spaces at studios, right, as a sort of incubator space or something. How can you secure that for longer term? How can you make sure that they can actually enjoy this low rent for a much longer time than the developer wants them or grants them to? So we went into that, right? And that's because we have actually a much more complex image.
There are two different phases, you know. One is before it happens, and one is when it happened, you know. And I think what Yumi says is more about programming thing, you know, like you interfere with that while just before it happens. The problem is that, well, there is what I found, for instance, I was invited to do a project like that in Chengdu, that it was a small project of 90 hectares with 5 museums. It was called a small project.
Yeah.
You know the one. And one of the most incredible things, of course, the first thing that happens, you know, and it's a problem of language, which is not about the language that you speak, but you know, whatever it was. But it's more about saying, okay, when I say artist, I don't say, I don't know, like somebody who's painting fans. Yeah, exactly. And then, especially with real estate developers, it's really a fascinating process, right? Because here you have, you know, projects that they have like investment for 15 years, and you know they have billions of dollars that, you know, and then you talk about chips for them, you know, things that they don't see as important, you know, and they understand that culturally there is a need of that. And then the second phase is more about, you know, like in the era of Mogan Shanlu on Qijiuba in Beijing, you know, that is more about just being at the edge, you know, of a gentrification. Then artists occupy certain kinds of building, and then, of course, everything changes quickly because then, then that area becomes right away hype, and then it becomes, and then you turn out that you have all the bad art staying, and all the good art is going, you know, because it's very expensive to stay there. But the third thing that I think is very interesting, and it brings back to the role also at a certain point of what we are doing in different sort of institutions, is actually when you are in a gentrified place like this one, with this particular, you know, institutions, and what actually this institution can do, you know, in this particular context to regain a sort of, you know, cultural density, you know. And then for me is something that also in Turin I try to do, because the museum is in a very strange situation in the sense that it's very central, but it's very close to one of the biggest community of Bangladeshi and Northern African in all Europe, actually. And we are really close to, so basically here is the museum, and this is all the area that I'm talking about. And right in the core of that, we have the biggest fresh market in all Europe, which is absolutely wonderful, where all the communities are coming, okay? So what is going to be the role of our, museum there, talking to the communities and bringing the communities in, first of all, why? What are you going to offer them? How you can interfere with that? So, and in the same area, you have like these huge, new food malls, right? Which of course is completely demonized, because it's gentrified, right? But I think that for me, what I'm trying to do here is actually to create connections, and to demystify the differences and try somehow to elevate a bit the real estate of the, whatever, and then creating a situation where we can bring, 300 children from all the schools around it, into the museum, doing activities, going back, using the public space. So it's really trying, I think, that institutions like, I think this one, or the work that we are doing, if you really want to make it political, it's not about refusing, but it's about contextualizing and also getting into, like being the evil, in a sense, that I always say, I don't know when they're gonna realize actually in the museum that I'm the son of Satan, that I'm trying to disrupt, somehow the institution itself, but disrupt with the logic, with the meaning, with the project, with consequential acts. And I think that this kind of, creating, like frameworks of interventions, which of course interferes with the city, the neighborhood, the people around you, other institutions, and it gets back to what I was saying before, this ability of talking different language, I can say interfering with, other systems, I think is probably the last barrier that, the cultural and artistic world have to still be, to still resisting, as a way of approaching life, a way of approaching production, meaning, like simple things, But I feel that for me is really very powerful, and it should be.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much. On that note, I'm afraid we're running out of time, but feel free
it's
to
always like that,
talk
now
to
that
us
we can.
afterward, give us your feedback or challenge us, tell us your questions or doubts, anything really. But thank you so much for
spending
this afternoon with us.
Everyone.
And thank you, David and Yomi, for wonderful contributions to make our modest place, very vibrant and full of, energetic thoughts.
Yeah.
So thank you.
We're looking
Thank
forward to the
next steps.
To the next step, yeah.
No pressure.
Stay
no
tuned.
pressure. Thank you.
Thank you.